Hello and welcome to this presentation on using physics in Unity 3D with the Playmaker asset. This is part of the 12th grade Computers and Technology class at JFK High School, where we are studying programming in Unity 3D and C# and specifically using the Playmaker visual programming asset or system. In this presentation, we're trying to cover what a collider means, what a trigger is, what a collision is, what a rigid body means, look at some of the properties of a rigid body, create an object with an on-trigger event, and create an object with an on-collision event. We're going to do this in code and do it inside of Playmaker. So first, some theory. If I go fast, and I am probably going to go fast, feel free to pause the video to see any of the notes that I've taken. Alright, so a collider can be thought of as simply the skin of an object. Alright, so if you have a cube, the collider would, it doesn't necessarily need to be true, but it could be thought of as the outside of the cube. So inside of Unity, any 3D object, and any object, if you want it to, has a collider component added to it. Alright, so generally colliders are used to do something if something touches an object. Alright, so if we look over here, we see inside of the inspector, here's an object that has a box collider. Alright. And we see a couple of the settings here. We have material, we have isTrigger, we have center or size. What this means is you can take any collider and make it a different size other than the object that it's attached to. So you can take a cube and add a collider to it and make the collider actually larger than the cube itself. Material, you can add a physic material, which we haven't covered in class, but we'll get to that. And isTrigger separates the collider into one of two categories. You either have a collider that is a trigger, which means that you can kind of pass through it, or as a collider, which means that you can't pass through it. Okay? Alright. So generally colliders, like I just said, are when something touches an object, so that's something you can't pass through, or when something enters an object, and that's something that you can pass through. Touching indicates that one collider has touched another collider. Think of a player character being hit by some damaging object. So you're playing this game and you're running around and some I don't know, some other player shoots you or shoots a bullet at you, and the bullet, the collider of the bullet strikes the collider of the player. Okay? When the object strikes the player, a function is called, because there's a specialized function inside of Unity. There's two of them. Well, there's several of them, but the ones we're going to talk about is onEnter or onCollision. And whenever this happens, you can do some checks. You can see some certain things about the collision itself or the object that has the collider. But generally, you say, well, whenever I get touched by something else, call this function or do this functionality. So do something. All right. So the function called for collisions is called on. That's not right. Yeah, I guess it is actually. Let me make sure. I do not want to lead you astray. Yeah, I guess it is. It sounds weird though. Okay. Alright, so on collision, enter. Alright, so there's a parameter that can be used but is not required. The parameter is information about the collision. Alright, so you can do things like see, how much force the collision hit with, or exactly what point that the collision happened. So if I get collided with on my collider on the front at, you know, around where my arm is or something like that. You can do those types of things. Excuse me. All right, so onward we go. So entering an object indicates that an object not moving and is not tangible and can be passed through. Think of a player entering a special zone where some kind of story automatically happens, or you get to a certain area in a stage or a level, and then these, you know, bugs start coming out of the wall, but it doesn't happen until you get to a specific point in the room, or you step on some kind of panel on the floor, and whenever you step on that panel, a door opens. All right. These special zones are called triggers. All right. So whenever your collider, or whenever the player's collider, or whenever, you know, one object's collider touches the collider of another object, but it's not physically there, you call it a trigger. Okay. So this function is called onTriggerEnter. Okay. There's also a parameter here, and it gives you information not about the collider. It gives you information, not the collision. It gives you information about the collider. I'm pretty sure. Yes, on the onTriggerEnter, it gives you information about the collider, not the collision. So I typed that wrong, but I said it right. Okay, onward. So here we can see that this box collider is the same as the previous one, but this one has the is trigger checkbox checked. So that means that this collider will not stop anything from passing through it. And you'll see what I'm talking about whenever we look at it inside of Unity. If you try to pass through this object, you can go right through it, no problem. All right, so that's what it means. If you don't have this checked, it means that it's physically present in the world, and that you can, you know, based on certain circumstances, move it, or it can maybe move you, etc., etc. All right, so the previously discussed functionality is part of what defines the Unity physics system, okay? And this is just our first taste of the physics system. This is built-in functionality that designers can take advantage of without doing the intricate coding to actually design the physics of a world. This is already included, and you can change some of these physics properties. You can change how much gravity there is in a scene, etc. We can take objects and make them be affected by gravity or not affected by gravity. Okay? However, to be seen by the Unity physics system, objects must have some way to tell it that the calculations on the object will be subjected to the rules of physics inside of the application. You do not necessarily have to do this with some things, but we're going to talk about something called a rigid body. Now, what is a rigid body? Well, a rigid body enables a designer to factor in gravity, forces, inertia, etc. on the behavior of an object. All right, so it also enables objects to actually be able to use the collider component physics functionality. If you don't have a rigid body on the object, you can't detect collisions. Okay. Without a rigid body, other components enabling physics behavior, the onTrigger and onCollider functions can't be used by the object. All right, so let's take a look at what all this means. First, we have the onTriggerEnter function. OnTriggerEnter is called when the collider other enters the trigger. So what is other? What are we talking about here? Other is the parameter name given to whatever touches it. Okay, so we can say whenever something touches this object, whenever something enters my trigger, I can get information about that object, and it's called other. So I can destroy whatever other is, or I can do other things. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go into Unity, And as you can see, firstly, that I have a green box. The green box will be the trigger box. We're going to do all of our trigger stuff here. The blue box is our collider box. Anything relating to colliders will be this box. And we have a red player. The collider blue and trigger green both have scripts attached to them. The trigger one is trigger listener. The collider one is collision listener. We're going to take a look at the script for trigger listener. The player has a very simple movement script attached to it. It just takes input from the horizontal axis and makes it move forward and backward. Likewise for left and right. And the trigger listener script, the only thing it does is has this function: on trigger enter, debug log, trigger entered. Okay, so whenever something touches or tries to go through this object, it's going to debug trigger entered. Alright, if we go to Unity, press play. I'm going to clear the console. Alright, so we can see here the console has nothing in it. I can go over here and move around this guy. Now, whenever I touch the green thing, because it has a box collider that is a trigger, that means I should be able to pass through the object. It also means that the script should actually trigger. Okay, it should say trigger entered whenever I touch this object. And if I can, there we go. Clear. Alright, trigger entered. Trigger entered, trigger entered, trigger entered. So each time I go through this box, that little bit of functionality runs. Okay. Next we'll look at collisions. Now, collisions are a little bit different in that it needs to have a rigid body. So let's take a look. On collision enter. So this function, on collision enter, is called when the collider or rigid body has begun touching another rigid body, collider. So one object has a rigid body, the other one has a rigid body or collider. Whenever they touch, this is what's called, if it's not a trigger. Okay, so if the collider is not registered as being a trigger, this gets called. Alright, so we can get information about the collision that's far outside the scope of this this introduction, but we will look at it later. Not in this presentation, later in class or later in another presentation. Alright, so if we look at that code for collision listener, the only thing it does is on collision enter, collider has been entered. Okay, now unlike a trigger, number one, it has to have a rigid body. Whether or not you use gravity is entirely, that's up to the programmer's choice, just depends. Go ahead and hit play and we'll see what happens. Now you can see right away collider has been entered even though I didn't enter. Alright, well why? Because gravity is on. Whenever I started this cube it fell. Alright, let's go ahead and move it up so you can see. See? Now whenever it touches the floor, which also has a collider, a mesh collider, it registers as a collision has taken place. Okay? Now I can take gravity off if I want to. Say I don't want gravity to actually affect this cube. I can set the gravity to nothing play, and it doesn't actually fall. All right, there's actually a little bit of space between the cube and the floor. All right, so I can move the cube now, but if I touch the cube, you'll see that they're actually, unlike the trigger you can pass through, there will be interaction between these two. See, I can push it, and because gravity's pushed off, it just flies away. All right, one more time. Maybe I can push it this way. Fly away, Stanley, be free. Now, that also means that I can turn on gravity, and yeah, it's going to interact with the floor, firstly, but now I can push it around on this plane, on the floor. And I can also push it off the plane, and it will fall to oblivion. Okay, so that's the difference. And you have, if something is a trigger, or something is not a trigger. Okay, if it is a trigger, you don't necessarily have to have a rigid body. You can have one, but you don't need one. Okay, for both of these, the player has to have a rigid body. If a collision here, you have to say rigid body to rigid body, and it also needs to be there for the trigger interaction, unless they change something. Let's test. Yeah, you have to have the rigid body on the player for either of these to take place. Now, if we go into the settings for a rigid body, let's take a look at some of them. First, we have mass, drag. So drag is actually how much, well, kind of how aerodynamic something is, or how much it will actually turn over time. Angular drag, that's more of a rotation kind of thing. Same concept, it's just rotation. Use gravity, we've explained. Is kinematic, we'll get to that later. These other things, constraints, freeze position and freeze rotation, these are important, especially if you have this on a player. Alright, so you saw how the cube was moving with all of these turned on. If I turn these off, you'll see that I actually have gravity affecting the player, which doesn't seem like a big deal at first. But if you move around a little bit, you can see that it's possible to now actually turn around, get turned around, and actually mess up my control system. Alright, and it's actually possible for this guy to get flipped over on his side and completely mess it up. Alright, so I do want him to be affected by gravity, but I turn these off. Let's say I turn off gravity now, hit play, and he moves the same way, but he's still affected. Now you can see he's starting to turn and then fly away, and I don't even know where he is now. So let's stop and play again. And now when I press up, he's still going forward, but I'm flying around like I'm in space, which is a cool effect, but it's, you know, it's probably not what you're going for, you know, a game that you can actually control. So what these constraints do are allow you to use something like gravity, so where this player actually will fall. No, actually, if you freeze the position, he won't fall either, at least in the Y. Let's turn on all these rotations, except we'll leave the Y off, and he will still fall, but he can't be turned around, and you know, all of that. So he can still fall to his death. All right, that's usually what I go with, but for testing, I'll turn on freeze position. All right, so next we're going to look at doing all of this functionality inside of Playmaker. Okay, And it's not that difficult. We'll go ahead and open up that scene. I have a scene already built, but without the Playmaker functionality. Alright, so you can see here we have the standard player movement. Very simple player movement inside of Playmaker. The state, all it does is it gets the horizontal and vertical axes and translate an object. Okay? Very simple. We've done this before. So, the blue cube and green cube both have nothing. So, let's do a trigger first. We'll make sure that the blue cube has a rigid body, but we don't need one. We can go ahead and remove it, and we'll come back to that in a second. So the green cube, we're going to make sure the box collider has on trigger checked. Okay, now we don't need to have a mesh renderer. We can have one. We don't need one though. To make an area that is actually just pass-throughable and you can't see it. I don't even know if pass-throughable is a word, but it is today. Maybe we don't want to make it cast shadows and receive shadows since it's not there. Alright, so we're going to take this box and we're going to make something happen whenever we make contact with it. So we'll go inside of Playmaker and we'll add a state. And the only thing this state will do is it's going to look for a trigger, and we have two different ones. We have trigger event and get trigger info. If you want to store a lot of different information about the collider, you can use get trigger info, but we want to make something happen, so we're going to use a trigger event. And this trigger event is just going to be, okay, which function do you want to run? We're going to use on trigger enter. There are two more, on trigger stay and on trigger exit, so you can make something happen whenever something leaves this box too. On trigger stay is generally if something goes and touches and goes inside of the box and stays for a determinate amount of time. Collide tag is pretty cool because what this can do is make sure that the event that you set up doesn't run unless whatever touches this has a certain tag. Now I'll show you what tags are in just a moment. We'll just run basic functionality first. And we'll add a simple state here. We're going to make this state connect to this one. To do that, we use events. So we're going to make an event and we'll say triggered. And all this is going to do is the only thing this is something that we can choose to switch states. It's the only thing it does if you're not familiar with using events. So we're going to add a transition because we want to transition from this state to this state in some way. So we right click, add a transition. Oh, triggered. Yeah, that sounds right. That's the one we just set up. So we'll add the triggered event. And the triggered event will lead us down into this state. And inside of this state, we'll simply have a debug. And the debug will just simply say triggered. Okay? So whenever something collides with this or triggers this, it's going to do what? Well, it's going to send the event triggered. So this will go here. Okay, we can set this off to the side so we can see it as it runs. Alright, so we can move the cube and we can make it collide with that box, and we can see that yes, we have our debug log and we have state 2 active over here. Now let's say we want to have more than one detection. Well, the only thing we do here is add a transition finished and loop it back around. If we don't do this, this box is only going to be triggered one time. And then after that, you can't trigger it again. But if you want some kind of trigger zone that's going to be able to do events multiple times, you need to loop it around to put it back in the listening state. Alright, so now we can see that yes, it collides, but it loops around back to the front. See? So you can see it over here looping. Okay. Now let's say we want this to actually trigger, but only if it's a player. Well, how can we do that? Well, Unity has these things called tags, and you can add many tags, okay? But we're going to use one that's already built in called the player tag. And all this is kind of like a categorization for objects. If for example, you can make pickup items, you know, give you health or give you points or whatever. And you could have a tag called pickup item and do a check for that. And you know, if the enemy goes through, you know, if a little enemy robot or enemy mushroom or whatever touches the power-up or the pickup item, you don't really want the enemy to be able to pick it up. But if the player touches it, it might be all right. So we're going to make this tag player. We're going to make the player have the tag player. So anything can look at this collider and the object that it's attached to and recognize that it has the tag player. So we know that it's the player. Alright, so before we do that, let's do it this way. Let's make the collide tag look for player. And we'll make the cube, the player cube, not have any tag. And we'll hit play. And as you'll see, the state will never get triggered. And the reason is, yes, there's a collision happening or there's a trigger happening, but it's also looking for something that has the player tag. Now, since the player currently does not have the player tag, the event doesn't get fired. But if we make the player have the tag player, or have this cube have the tag player, now it will actually do the collision, and it detects that yes, this thing is colliding with me, and yes, it does have the player tag. Alright. Next we'll look at the blue cube. The blue cube is standard cube, just with a simple blue material attached to it. Right now we have is trigger not checked. So if we were to add a rigid body, we could move over here and push this thing around, just like that. No problem. But what if we want something to actually happen also? Besides being able to just push the box or the ball or whatever around, we want something else to happen too. So for this, we're going to use a collision. Alright, so we're going to make an FSM on the collider cube blue. So right click, add an FSM, and the action we're going to add is collision event, just like trigger event. We're going to make a collision event. Alright, so same types of things we can do on collision enter, on collision stay, on controller collider hit, which that gets into the player controller. On collision exit, same types of things. Collide tag, we just went over what that is. send event, and we can also store the collider that it makes contact with, and we can also store the force with which the hit happens. So more force equals more damage, or whatever. Alright, so we have the send event, so we're going to make this transition to another state whenever this happens. So we'll make another event. We'll call this one something hit me. Alright, simple event, descriptive name. We'll add this transition, something hit me, and it has to lead into something or else you'll get this error. Transition is missing a target state. So we need to actually target a transition to go into another state. In this state, we'll do a simple debug log. And we'll just say collision. Alright, so whenever a collision takes place, we will send the event something hit me. Alright. Collide tag right now is looking for untagged. So let's see what happens. Okay, well, why did it do this? Because it hit the ground. Alright, and the floor is untagged. So let's change this to, it doesn't really matter, we'll change it to game controller. Alright, so only if something that is untagged touching this, say untagged, only if something is untagged will we get any kind of reaction. So if the player touches it, there's no reaction as far as this is concerned, because the player does have a tag, the player tag. If we change this to untagged and hit play, now we will get a reaction inside of the state, because yes, what has hit this this collider is untagged and a collision did occur. Alright, now just like before, we can do this check for the player tag and change the player to have that tag. Get the same reaction again. Alright. Same thing as before. If we want this to actually happen more than once, we add a finished transition. So whenever that debug log is finished, we can loop around back to the beginning. So we can have more than one output message, or more than one bit of functionality to happen. Otherwise, you can only do it one time. Alright. So that finishes up this using physics in Unity 3D Playmaker presentation. If you're in my class, be prepared to use this information for a miniature project next class. If you're not in my class and stumbled here by accident, I hope you learned what you came here hoping to learn. Regardless of either case, I hope you picked up something to use in your own projects, and hope to see you next time. Have a great day.